Today we're going to talk about how to use Redux. The basis of Redux is that you have a single centralized state that is based off the flux pattern. You have your component, a user does something on the page, an event, that triggers an action, that gets dispatched to the store, you save this data in the store, and then your component re-renders. Redux looks similar to that in the fact that you have your UI, it triggers an action, it gets sent to a reducer, and then your reducer updates the store contains the state, which gets sent to your UI, and then your UI will update. Why would you want to use Redux? It gives you a way to know where state should live in a big, complex application. It makes state predictable via immutable and pure functions. Debugging tools are really good. Redux is strict-ish about how your code should be organized. It makes it easier when going into existing applications to know how things are laid out and what the application actually stores. It's very easy to test. It allows undoing and redoing actions, and it's easy to rehydrate your store on page loads or changes. Redux has 3 principles, and it's very important to understand these to understand Redux. The first one is single source of truth. What that means is you have a single store with nested domain inside of it, and it makes it easy to keep track of how that is changing. The second principle is the state is read-only. What that means is you can't edit the state directly, and how you update the state is you trigger an action and you go through that whole flux flow. The third principle is that changes are made with pure functions. Alright, so let's go back to this diagram and let's describe each parts of these and how we're going to be using them in our application. Actions are helper functions or promises in Redux. These functions or promises facilitate passing the event that happened in the UI and describes what happened in it. And it is the only way you can send data from your UI to your Redux store. So once you trigger an action from the UI, it gets sent to your reducer. The reducer is a place to determine how your state is going to change, and it does this with a pure function. So a reducer is actually a function, just like your action is a function. And the reason it's pure is because it doesn't mutate state directly. State is immutable. You have to make a copy of state and then return in your function your new copy. So that new copy gets sent to the store. The store is a singleton object that holds the object tree of the entire application. It also holds functions we need to dispatch our actions to call the reducer. And like I said, the store is a singleton which contains state, and when that state changes, it passes it to your UI, and then your UI will get new props, and then your UI will re-render. Alright, so we covered what Redux is, why you would use it, the 3 principles that Redux uses, and the components of Redux. Let's jump into Brolift, an application we're building on this channel, and see how we're using Redux in that application. So here I've got an application, it has a landing page, and then you can track a workout, and on this page we have multiple elements in the UI that I want to send a state. So for example, I want to have a workout called chest workout. And I want to put that in the state, so if I decide to leave and then come back, it's still there. So our home page doesn't contain any information we want to store in the state. But what we do want to store is everything on this page. We want to store this lift in state. So let's look at the code. So the first thing you want to do in your application after you've npm installed Redux is you want to pull React Redux into the root of your application, so your index.js at the root of the app. In this case, mine's called Brolift. As you can see here, we pulled this line in, and we're going to create a provider that wraps the entire application because there's only a single state in this application. The provider takes a store, which you need to create. So here we have imported create store. Create store is going to take 3 arguments, but the main one we care about is called a root reducer. And what that means is, like I mentioned before, you can have multiple domains or chunks of state in your single state. It is considered a tree, and in the root reducer, you're going to have all of the branches of the tree. The second argument is going to be a default state. In this case, we want to load the page with no state at all. You can, however, have your root component take props and set a default state to hydrate your state. This was what I was talking about, how you can rehydrate on page loads. And then this third argument is where you can apply middleware so people can extend Redux. In this case, we're using thunk because we want to make API calls. So if you look here, we've got a provider and we're passing in a store. And that's how you get it set up. So like I was mentioning before, we want to set up a root reducer. So let's go ahead and jump into that code and see what that looks like. In this application, my root reducer is stored in a Redux folder at the root of my application. We're going to have multiple reducers in the root reducer, and that's how we're going to have nested objects inside of our state. And we'll see what that looks like later in the debugging tools. So what you do is you import combine reducers from Redux, and then you call the function, you pass in all your reducers. Let's go ahead and jump into exercises and see what an exercise reducer is. And to give you context of what this should be doing is exercises are going to be just a drop down of exercises I call from an API. So here I've got the folder open on the left inside my Redux that has a file called actions, reducers, and types. Let's start with types. Types are a way for you to define and name for actions. You don't have to do this, but this is nice because we're going to pull it in multiple files, so we just want a constant for these. Next, let's jump over into actions. So here we are, we're in our actions. We want to be able to tell our application when we're going to start fetching these exercises from the API. We want to know if the API returned successfully or if it returned an error. And if it was successful, let's go ahead and store the exercises. So we're going to say fetch exercise begin. It's just a string. That's a way for me to know, hey, I triggered this action. Let me update my state in the store. And so that's the first action we're going to look at. Let's look at the reducer that gets called from this action. So we've got our reducer open, and the first thing you want to note is that we've got our types in again, so we can have the same string matching up, so Redux knows what code to execute. The second part is you always want an initial state. In this case, I want loading to be false, meaning I haven't triggered to fetch these exercises yet. And then what you do is you create a function that takes the initial state for the first argument, and then an action. As you can see in our action over here, we've got a type, and we can access this object in our reducer. So we can set up a switch statement, check the type, and then execute code only when the type matches. So what we want to do is we want to splat our state, meaning make a copy of it, and then we want to override loading and errors. In this case, we want loading to be true now that we're going to go fetch our API, so that will trigger the front end to say, hey, I'm loading, let me put a spinner on the page. And then we want to reset errors just in case we have to refetch again. Okay, so we've got our types, we've got our actions, and we've got our reducers. How do we use them on the page? So you already have your view layer. And generally what you want to do is you want to make a connected component that's connected to the state. And these components are usually called containers, and they're usually separate files. However, if you're making small connected components, sometimes you'll see it all in one file. But in this case, I'm doing an entire page, which isn't the best way to do React, but that's the way we have it right now. And I want to connect this entire page to the store. So here's my view layer. It's just an index in this folder. I already created a container. Like I mentioned before, we want to connect our view layer to our store. And so what we've got on this first line here is we've got React Redux. We want to connect our view component to this new component called a container. We're going to use that via this connect function. And then we want to import our view layer. So this is track workout index that we just looked at. We're going to ignore lines 3 through 17 right now. We're going to come back to that later. But the next part we want to jump to is map state to props. And so what this function is going to do is it's going to take an argument of the state from the store. And then you're going to return props that are going to go to your view layer. And what these props are, they're domain from the state. So in this case, we've got state.exercises, and the reason it's state.exercises is if we go to our root reducer, so again, we're going to our Redux folder, opening the root reducer, and we can see we have exercises here. So let's go ahead and go back to our container. So we know where exercises is getting set, and we know that in our reducer, we set what is inside of exercises. So let's jump back to that. So here we go. We've got our initial state. This is what it is by default. So when I do state.exercises, this is the initial state. As you can see here, this is what the reducer is getting set to. And then when we call fetch exercises begin, we're changing what is inside of state. So now let's go over to our view layer and see how that gets passed into props. All right, so we've got our view layer, we've got our functional component, we've got the exercises as a prop, and then we're using it down below inside of our bootstrap select to create the options from state. So when you initially load this page, you're going to get an empty select. But what we want to do is we want to now dispatch an action from our view layer to go fetch more exercises from the API on our backend. Let's hop back to our container to figure out how we're going to do that. So the next part of our container is we need to map dispatch to props. What that means is we want to have Redux pass in a dispatch function to our own created functions so that we can call certain actions. So if you take a look at line 34, we have something called get exercises, which dispatches fetch exercises. But that doesn't look familiar to our action that is called fetch exercises begin. The reason that is generally when you're going to make an API call, you store that in a service object. So this is actually a function from the service object. I'm going to go ahead and open that up and we can take a look. So here we go. We've got fetch exercises and we've got a dispatch again. It is going to dispatch exercises.fetch exercises begin. So if you look here, we've exported an object that stores that function. We're going to go ahead and dispatch that. And then after we dispatch that, we're going to continue on because this is async and we're using thump. We're going to use Axios to go call our API. We're going to fetch the exercises. If it's successful, then we're going to dispatch success. So success takes in exercises as an argument. We're going to put that in our store. If it fails, we want to store an error. And that's the gist of the code. Let's go ahead and see with the debugging tool in Redux what's actually happening behind the scenes. So here we go. We've got our application open. Let's go ahead and reload. You can see on the component mounting, it calls fetch exercise begin. The API call got made, and then it was successful, and then the state changed. So if you're not familiar with this tool, I'll have a link down to it in the description. But it'll allow you to see your current state and the actions, what it went through, and how the state changed. So if I go back here, before I fetch my data, my exercises is empty. And then after I was successfully fetching my API, I can then see what it is here. And you can imagine this being more powerful when you have like 12 things happening when your component mounts, that you can flip through and see piece by piece and go back and forth to see what's happening, what data is changing. And you can actually see the diff here, or you can go to state and see the whole object. So this is really useful if you want to dig into your state, see what it currently is and how it's changing. So let's take a look at our code and figure out how this whole chain of fetching the API, getting the response, actually happened in our view component. So as you can see here on line 34, we map something called get exercises to props. Let's open up our view component. Let's search for get exercises. So you can see it's a prop here in our functional component. We're using an effect, and if you're not familiar with hooks in React, I have a video that I just made last week. I'll have a link to it above my head somewhere that you can click and go watch that if you're not familiar with hooks. But what this is it's basically saying on component will mount, let's go ahead and get our exercises. That calls that prop, which gets set here, which dispatches fetch exercises in our container. This is changing. The prop changes in our view layer. Exercises changes. Component gets re-rendered. And then our dropdown has data. Hope this was helpful. It's a very rudimentary making an API call, setting up a loading state and error state, and I've successfully fetched my data and then updating our view layer. If you have any questions about Redux, please drop me a comment down below. If you've liked this video and you've learned something, please drop me a like. And if you'd like to see more videos about Redux or Rails or React or how to use certain software, go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell notification so you know when the next episode happens. Thanks, y'all. Hope you have a great day.